By the spring of 1940, Britain faced a quiet catastrophe beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. Each month, 300,000 tons of merchant shipping vanished into cold gray waters, sent to the ocean floor by German U-boats. Cargoes of grain, oil, and ammunition, lifelines that fed both factories and families, were being erased faster than shipyards could replace them. The Atlantic, vast and indifferent, had become a battlefield defined not by land or air, but by arithmetic. At the Admiralty in London, Winston Churchill studied the numbers. 200 escort vessels stood between Britain and starvation. 200 to defend thousands of miles of convoy routes stretching from North America to the British Isles. It was a calculation without mercy. Each escort could only guard so many ships, cover so much distance, and survive so many attacks. The sums never balanced. The nation's lifeline was bleeding out faster than it could be stitched. The destroyer had long been the pride of the Royal Navy. Sleek, powerful, and fast, they embodied everything British naval tradition admired. Their decks bristled with guns, torpedoes, and sensors that could hunt a submarine miles away. But those ships came at a cost no one could afford. Nearly $1 million each in 1940s money, and a year and a half of skilled labor to complete. Even if every yard worked day and night, Britain might launch 30 in a year. Meanwhile, German shipyards launched U-boats by the dozen every month. The math was turning fatal. In May, as France began to crumble under German invasion, a naval architect named William Reed presented something radical, something almost ridiculous. His blueprint didn't look like a warship at all. It came from his earlier work on a commercial whaling ship designed for icy southern seas. Sturdy, cheap, and easy to build, it used common steel, off-the-shelf machinery, and simple lines that any coastal yard could understand. It was ugly, slow, and entirely unglamorous. But Reed's design could be built for $90,000 and completed in 8 months. To the Admiralty, it was a strange proposal. A fishing vessel dressed for war. But to men like Commander George Cray, who understood that the battle wasn't about perfect ships but about presence, the logic was clear. 10 of these small ships could patrol where one destroyer stood before. The ocean didn't demand brilliance, it demanded coverage. Britain didn't need heroes, it needed hulls. By the summer of 1940, as Luftwaffe bombers filled the skies over Britain, shipyards along the coast received urgent orders. 58 of the new vessels would be built immediately. They would be called the Flower class, named after garden plants, Bluebell, Gladiolus, Campanula, humble names for humble ships. As sparks flew from welding torches and riveters hammered into steel, a new kind of fleet began to take shape. A fleet not of perfection, but of persistence. Each corvette was short and round, a mere 200 feet long, rolling heavily even in calm seas. They lacked speed, power, and glamour. Yet beneath their simplicity lay something revolutionary. They could be built anywhere. They could be manned by anyone. And most importantly, they could be built fast. The Admiralty had finally found a way to change the equation. The war at sea was no longer a duel of elegant destroyers chasing lone submarines. It was becoming a contest of endurance and multiplication, of who could fill the Atlantic faster. Britain was learning to fight not with brilliance, but with numbers. As the first Flower-class ships slid into the water, the North Atlantic waited, vast and deadly. Somewhere in those endless gray waves, German wolf packs were already gathering. And soon, the small corvettes with names of flowers would sail straight into their hunting grounds. By the autumn of 1940, the Atlantic had become a graveyard marked only by oil slicks and drifting debris. Every week, another convoy disappeared into fog and flame. To the merchant sailors who crossed those waters, the ocean seemed alive, filled with invisible predators that struck without warning. Beneath the waves, Admiral Karl Donitz's U-boat fleet was perfecting a new kind of warfare. Each submarine, or U-boot as the Germans called them, had once hunted alone. They would stalk, strike, and vanish. But Donitz saw that this wasted the advantage of stealth. Instead, he built his new doctrine around cooperation, what he called Rudeltaktik, the wolf pack. One submarine would shadow a convoy, sending coded reports through the night sky while others converged. When enough had gathered, They struck all at once, from every direction. A convoy's escorts could chase one, perhaps two attackers, but not 6, not 8, not 12. The ocean became geometry and timing, and the Germans mastered both. On the night of October 18, 1940, Convoy SC-7 sailed from Nova Scotia with 43 merchant ships. Only 2 escorts guarded them. In the grey dawn off Iceland, the sea erupted with torpedoes. 21 merchantmen vanished within hours. Survivors clung to wreckage as fires burned across the water. The U-boats slipped away untouched. For Britain, the massacre was a warning written in blood. The old way of fighting was finished. At the Admiralty, Churchill read the reports in silence. The losses were beyond endurance. Food, oil, ammunition, all gone. The U-boats were not simply winning battles. They were threatening Britain's survival. The Prime Minister understood the geometry of despair. Too few ships. Too wide an ocean. Too many submarines. But while destroyers were trapped in dockyards, the new corvettes were beginning to arrive. Small yards from Belfast to Aberdeen launched them into the grey waters at astonishing speed. They were crude, unpainted, and still smelling of hot steel, but they could sail. And that alone mattered. The first, HMS Gladiolus, left for sea trials in September. She looked like no warship the Royal Navy had ever built. Her bow curved like a fishing boat, her engines thudded like factory machinery, but her crew knew she was the beginning of something new. For Dönitz, the coming months were his happy time. Each U-boat commander sent back triumphant messages. Convoys burned in every quadrant of the Atlantic. Yet beneath that success, the balance was beginning to shift. Every week brought new corvettes from the yards. 10 here, 12 there, small and slow, but each one adding another set of eyes to the convoys. The Germans had to search harder, stay on the surface longer, risk more for every kill. By late 1941, the wolf pack still hunted, but they were being hunted in return. In the grey dawn, periscopes glimpsed silhouettes on the horizon, stubby hulls with single guns and low funnels. They seemed harmless, almost comical, yet they were everywhere. A U-boat commander could no longer surface without finding one nearby. The corvettes lacked power, but they had patience, and in the Atlantic, patience could kill. The battle was becoming a test not of skill, but of endurance. For every destroyer lost, Britain could build 10 corvettes. For every U-boat sunk, Germany needed months to train a new crew. The ocean was being filled, mile by mile, with ships that were never supposed to fight at all. Fishing vessels reborn as guardians of the convoys. Whaling hulls turned into hunters of submarines. The first months were brutal. Crews were seasick, soaked, and frozen. Their ships rolled violently, groaning in the waves, their decks slick with ice. Yet they stayed at sea, refusing to yield the lanes of supply. In their endurance lay the first hint of victory, though no one could see it yet. The wolf pack still ruled the Atlantic, but their reign had gained an expiration date. The flowers were blooming in grey water, and soon, their numbers would choke the hunters themselves. The shipyards of Britain had never seen anything like it. Along the coasts of Scotland, Wales, and northern England, the air shuddered with the rhythm of hammers. Sparks rained across half-finished hulls as riveters worked in freezing wind and rain. These were not the grand naval yards of Portsmouth or Devonport. They were small commercial docks, places that had once built fishing trawlers and cargo boats. Now, they were turning out warships. Each Flower-class corvette began as a simple merchant hull, cut from commercial-grade steel, 3/8 of an inch thick. The design came straight from William Reed's whaling ships. The bow was rounded, the decks narrow, the proportions short and stout. There was nothing elegant about them. But they were practical, and that mattered more than beauty. Any shipyard could build one. Any crew could learn to sail it. The Admiralty had simplified everything. Riveted construction instead of welded seams. Reciprocating steam engines instead of complex turbines. A single propeller, one rudder, and engines that had once powered tugboats and factory plants. Heavy, inefficient, and loud, they vibrated through the decks until teeth rattled and bolts shook loose. But they were available. In a war measured by months, not years, that word meant survival. At John Crown and Sons in Sunderland, work crews labored beneath open skies. They heated rivets cherry red in portable forges, hurled them across the slipway, and hammered them home with pneumatic guns. The sound carried for miles, metal on metal, the heartbeat of wartime industry. There were no breaks for weather, no delays for comfort. The North Sea wind cut through every coat, but the work continued. When the keel of HMS Campanula was laid in November 1940, few believed she would sail before the next summer. 7 months later, she was complete and steaming for the western approaches. The speed of production was staggering. Smith's Dock Company launched one new corvette every 17 days at the height of the program. The workforce came from shipbreaking yards, locomotive factories, even mines. They were men and women who had never touched a warship before. None had naval certification. None needed it. The design was simple enough to teach on the job. Britain was proving that the key to winning the Atlantic War was not sophistication, but repetition. Every rivet driven into steel shortened the odds against starvation. For every destroyer that required 18 months of expert labor, British yards produced nearly 50 corvettes. The destroyers were masterpieces, but they were also single points of failure. Lose one, and you lost a year of work. Lose a corvette, and a replacement would be ready within weeks. The war was shifting from craftsmanship to mass production. Perfection had been traded for persistence. By December 1941, 151 corvettes patrolled the Atlantic. They sailed from icy northern ports and gray western harbors, their hulls streaked with salt, their decks echoing with the hum of worn engines. They were the unglamorous backbone of the convoys, the small ships that filled the empty spaces where no destroyer could go. Together, they began to stitch a fragile shield across the ocean. Each launch was a quiet victory, measured not in ceremony but in sound. The screech of steel on rails, the hiss of the sea meeting fresh paint, the roar of a crowd of tired workers cheering as another hull slipped free. Every ship launched was one less gap in the line, one more reason to hope that the supply routes might hold. The corvettes were never meant to be perfect. They were meant to exist, to float, to sail, and to protect. And as their numbers grew, something extraordinary happened. The balance of the war at sea began, slowly, to tilt. The destroyers still represented the ideal of naval power. The corvettes represented its reality. They were forged in steel and salt, and soon, they would be baptized by fire. By early 1942, the ocean had swallowed too many destroyers. The Royal Navy had entered the war with nearly 200 of them, proud gray blades of steel that had ruled the seas in peace. But one by one, they vanished beneath the waves, victims of torpedoes, mines, and the cruel arithmetic of attrition. Each loss was more than a ship. It was months of irreplaceable craftsmanship, thousands of skilled hands erased in a moment of fire and foam. The destroyer HMS Electra embodied everything Britain once believed about war at sea. Her turbines could drive her to 36 knots, fast enough to overtake any submarine that surfaced. 8 guns and a bank of torpedo tubes made her a predator among predators. Her sonar could detect an enemy a mile away. She cost $900,000 to build, and she took 18 months of the best labor in the country. She was a masterpiece of precision engineering. On the 27th of February, 1942, she was gone. Sunk in the Java Sea in 7 minutes. When she went down, Britain lost more than a ship. It lost time, money, and experience that could never return. Each destroyer destroyed was a wound the fleet could not heal quickly enough. By contrast, when the small corvette HMS Gladiolus was sunk in the North Atlantic, the blow barely registered in the Admiralty's balance sheets. Her replacement, HMS Heliotrope, was already under construction. Within 7 weeks, she was at sea. The math told a brutal truth. One destroyer gone meant years of rebuilding. One corvette gone meant another launched before the ocean had finished swallowing the last. In the cold language of logistics, that difference became survival. 47 corvettes were lost during the war. Replacing them all cost about $4 million. Less than the price of 5 destroyers. The ocean was merciless, but Britain had learned how to endure its hunger. It no longer fought the sea with a few perfect swords. It fought with a swarm of blunt, sturdy shields. Even time itself favored the humble. When the destroyer HMS Opportune was laid down in 1940, her crew would not see her completed until 25 months later. During that same span, British yards launched 127 corvettes. Each one joined a convoy, escorted a freighter, and filled the Atlantic with the sound of human defiance. None of them were fast. None of them were graceful. But they were there. The ocean did not care about design elegance or engineering perfection. It cared only about presence. The wolf packs that once roamed freely now faced fleets of escorts so thick that every angle of attack met resistance. The mathematics that once doomed Britain had turned against Germany. Dönitz could build 20 submarines in a month, but he could not train their crews faster than he was losing them. The corvettes were everywhere, relentless as the tides, and their very existence denied him space to hunt. At the Western Approach's command, Admiral Percy Noble finally saw the numbers add up. He calculated that 300 escorts were the minimum needed to protect Britain's lifeline. At destroyer production rates, it would have taken 8 years to reach that number. With corvettes, Britain achieved it in less than 2. For the first time since the war began, the convoys had enough guardians to survive the crossing. The irony was sharp. The mighty destroyer, with all its brilliance, had become strategically irrelevant. It was a weapon designed for a kind of war that no longer existed. The corvette, born from desperation and built with crude efficiency, had become indispensable. Wars were not won by perfect weapons that arrived too late, but by good enough weapons that arrived in time. By the spring of 1942, the corvettes owned the night seas. They rolled, creaked, and shuddered, but they sailed on, engines pounding through storms that broke stronger ships. Every plank and plate was a statement of defiance. Britain had traded luxury for survival, and the trade was paying off. The Atlantic was still deadly, but it was no longer hopeless. Life aboard a Flower-class corvette was misery wrapped in steel. The sailors who manned them said the ships were halfway to hell, and they meant it. The ocean punished them without pause. The hulls, short and rounded, were built for whaling seas, not the endless violence of the North Atlantic. In calm weather, they rolled. In bad weather, they writhed. 40 degrees to port, a heartbeat of stillness, 40 degrees to starboard, again and again, every 8 seconds. The motion never stopped. It wasn't the storm that made men sick, it was the routine. Able seaman Ronald Rundle, one of many young men aboard HMS Gladiolus, learned this the hard way. On an ordinary Tuesday morning, under overcast skies and a steady force 6 wind, the ship pitched so hard that soup bowls and tools crashed across the mess deck. 2/3 of the crew were already retching into buckets or over the rail. The rest had given up eating days earlier. They were soaked, shivering, and hungry. It wasn't courage that kept them at their posts. It was duty, and the knowledge that every convoy behind them depended on it. The corvettes had no luxury, no comfort, and little space. 80 men lived in quarters built for half that number. Hammocks hung so close together that you could feel another man breathing beside you. The walls sweated with condensation. Seawater seeped through the vents and around the watertight doors until everything was damp. Uniforms never dried. Mold spread over boots, mattresses, and even the walls. Men slept in the same wet clothes for days, sometimes weeks. Cold gnawed at them constantly. Heating was almost non-existent. Small coal stoves provided faint warmth, but they were forbidden during night watches because the smoke made the ship too visible. So men stood on deck in freezing winds, wrapped in layers of wet wool, scanning the dark horizon. Frost-bitten fingers clutched binoculars and gun grips as the waves slammed against the bow. In winter, the spray froze into jagged ice that coated the rails and turned every surface into glass. 12 frostbite cases on a single crossing were considered routine. The engines offered no comfort. Their deep thumping shook the hull from keel to deck. Vibrations rattled teeth and loosened bolts. The smell of oil and steam clung to everything. The noise never stopped, even when men tried to sleep. The only silence came during attacks, when the engines slowed and the crew waited for the hollow boom of a torpedo. And yet, these miserable ships performed miracles. They stayed at sea longer than any other vessel in the fleet, 240 days per year on average. They could not chase U-boats on the surface. They were too slow. But they did not need to. Their strength was endurance. While destroyers returned to port for repairs and rest, corvettes remained on station, crawling across the Atlantic beside the convoys, hour after hour, wave after wave. They existed to be there, to deny the enemy the empty ocean he needed. Every man aboard learned to function inside the misery. They ate cold rations, slept in damp hammocks, and accepted seasickness as part of life. They worked without complaint because they understood something profound. Their suffering bought time. Every hour a convoy stayed afloat meant another day Britain could fight, another shipment that reached its destination. By early 1941, the corvettes began to strike back. HMS Gladiolus sank a German U-boat that March, catching it on sonar and dropping a pattern of depth charges that cracked its hull deep below. It was U-47, commanded by one of Germany's most celebrated aces. 45 men died. The Royal Navy lost only a few drums of explosives worth $35 each. The cost of victory had finally inverted. Throughout the year, more U-boats followed. HMS Bluebell, HMS Campanula, HMS Narcissus. One by one, they added their kills to the tally. The corvettes did not win through superior design, but through endless persistence. They were always at sea, always waiting, always present. The hunters had become the hunted. The sailors aboard knew none of the glory. Their uniforms were soaked, their hands blistered, their eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. But they held the line. The convoys behind them reached port, and Britain endured another winter. The corvettes were crude, ugly, and slow. But they were exactly what the war demanded. The flowers had learned to bloom in hell. By the end of 1941, the numbers finally began to change. For the first time in 2 years, the balance in the Atlantic tilted away from despair. The small, ugly ships that had been dismissed as stopgaps were quietly rewriting the rules of war. The Flower-class corvettes, built from whaling designs and merchant steel, were now sinking more U-boats than all the destroyers combined. It was not because they were better. It was because they were there. Each destroyer, with its turbines and delicate systems, spent nearly half its life in port, resting or being repaired. The corvettes, with their primitive engines and simple fittings, spent 70% of their lives at sea. They did not require specialized yards or intricate maintenance. They could refuel, restock, and return to duty within days. Every extra day at sea meant more convoys protected, more U-boats found, and more lives saved. In a war measured by logistics, presence had become the deadliest weapon of all. When a U-boat spotted a convoy guarded by corvettes, it no longer attacked freely. The submarines could move faster on the surface than the corvettes could chase them, but the corvettes never stopped hunting. They forced the submarines to dive, where they became slow and deaf. Once submerged, a U-boat crawled at 7 knots, blind except for sound. The corvettes, plodding along at 16 knots, could now outlast and outmaneuver them. They circled, dropped depth charges, and waited. Sometimes for hours. Sometimes for days. The ocean was vast, but patience made it small. The commanders called it terrier warfare. The corvettes could not outrun the wolves, but they could cling to them, bark at them, and refuse to let go. It was a battle of exhaustion, and the corvettes never tired. Still, the cost was high. The ocean claimed its tribute. On the 16th of October, 1941, HMS Gladiolus was torpedoed and sunk by U-568 south of Iceland. She went down in 4 minutes, taking 80 of her 85 crew. The loss was devastating to those who served with her, but strategically, it changed nothing. Another corvette replaced her within weeks. The line held. The ocean swallowed ships, but not the system that built them. Between 1940 and 1945, 47 corvettes were destroyed. 22 by U-boats, 11 by aircraft, 7 by mines, 4 by surface action, 3 by collision. Each loss was a tragedy, but none were crippling. Britain had built too many for that. The shipyards kept working, and replacements kept launching. By mid-1942, more than 200 corvettes patrolled the Atlantic. Their impact was extraordinary. Official records after the war showed that corvettes took part in the destruction of 294 German submarines. 47 were solo kills, the rest shared with other ships or aircraft. No other class of Allied warship came close. Destroyers accounted for 174 kills. Frigates, 187. Only aircraft surpassed the corvette's tally, with 386 kills. The humble whaler-turned-warship had become one of the deadliest submarine hunters of the war. The mathematics were brutal but beautiful. 47 corvettes lost. $4 million in total cost. 294 submarines destroyed, each worth $250,000 to Germany. The economic ratio alone spoke volumes. The human cost was even greater for the enemy. Each U-boat carried a crew of 40 to 50 men, specialists trained for nearly a year. By 1943, Donitz could no longer replace them fast enough. The wolf packs were thinning out. Germany had built more than 1,100 U-boats by the end of the war, but only 40% were ever at sea at one time. The rest were docked, repaired, or training. The corvettes, crude and cramped as they were, maintained 70% operational availability. It was a quiet revolution in warfare, simplicity beating sophistication through sheer presence. Every time a corvette rolled through the gray swells beside a convoy, it added another fraction to the final equation. Every hour at sea was a small subtraction from Germany's power. Every torpedo dodged, every submarine driven down, was another number tipping toward survival. The corvettes were no longer merely filling space. They were shaping destiny. The hunters of the deep had found themselves outnumbered, outlasted, and outthought by ships built not for glory, but for necessity. The Atlantic, once ruled by fear, was beginning to feel safe again. By 1943, Britain's shipyards had become something close to miracles. What once were sleepy docks for fishing trawlers now roared like industrial hives, glowing orange in the winter dark. Sparks rained over the riverbanks as cranes swung massive hull plates into place. The air smelled of oil, smoke, and salt. Every hammer strike echoed with the same message: build faster. The Corvette program had transformed not only the Navy but the nation's entire maritime industry. These ships were deliberately designed to be simple enough for anyone to make. Reed's original plan had ensured that every decision favored speed over sophistication. Riveted seams instead of welded ones. Steam engines that had powered tugboats or factory machines instead of delicate turbines. Off-the-shelf hardware instead of bespoke naval fittings. The result was a warship that could be built in the same time it took to make a trawler, using tools already lying idle in small coastal yards. Factories that once produced locomotives now built engines for the Flower class. Workshops that had turned out mining equipment began forging propeller shafts. Even foundries that made machinery for textile mills learned to cast parts for corvette boilers. The entire industrial map of Britain shifted toward the sea. Every rivet driven, every pipe fitted, became another act of resistance. Smith's Dock Company in Middlesbrough reached an astonishing rhythm. A new corvette slid down its slipway every 17 days. The workers there were not the elite craftsmen of the Royal Dockyards. They were laborers, welders, and apprentices, many of them too old or too young for the front lines. They built ships under open skies, working through rain, sleet, and blackout nights. No one called them heroes, yet their fingerprints were welded into the steel that kept Britain alive. It was mass production at a scale the Royal Navy had never imagined. The destroyers of the pre-war fleet had been singular creations, handcrafted weapons for a bygone era of naval duels. The corvettes, by contrast, were products of repetition. Standardized blueprints. Interchangeable parts. Modular fittings. A damaged engine could be replaced with one pulled from a warehouse shelf or a retired tug. A corvette lost in battle could be rebuilt in a matter of months. For the first time in its history, the Royal Navy was learning the language of industrial warfare. This philosophy extended even to repairs. A destroyer, when damaged, required return to a specialized yard and weeks of delicate work. A corvette limped into port, found an engine from a merchant ship, and was back at sea within days. Their machinery was crude, but their simplicity gave them a kind of immortality. The Admiralty calculated that corvettes spent on average only 22 days between missions, compared to 14 for destroyers, despite harsher conditions. It was the difference between a fleet of fragile perfection and a fleet that simply refused to stop. The German High Command never understood this shift. Dönitz begged his superiors for smaller, faster-to-build submarines to match Britain's pace. Instead, they doubled down on complexity. The new Type 21 U-boats were engineering marvels, capable of staying submerged indefinitely, faster underwater than on the surface, and packed with revolutionary systems. But each took 2 years to complete. By the time they entered service, the battle for the Atlantic was already lost. Britain's corvettes, crude as they were, had created a different kind of power, one measured not in capability, but in availability. While Germany's submarines waited for perfect designs, Britain filled the ocean with good enough. The war had become a contest between factories and workshops, between precision and production. And in that race, Britain's humble shipyards were winning. In dockside pubs, riveters toasted the launches as if each one were a newborn child. The slips were lined with wives and children waving at the ships that bore names of flowers: bluebell, azalea, marigold, names that sounded more like poems than weapons. The irony was not lost on them. These were the ships that made sure Britain could still eat, still fight, still hope. They were built from sweat, smoke, and speed. They were imperfect, unstoppable, and alive. And soon, they would help turn the tide of the entire war. By the spring of 1943, the Atlantic had become something different. What had once been a hunting ground for the wolf packs was turning into a killing field for the hunters themselves. Convoys no longer sailed naked through gray, lonely waters. Now, they moved under an umbrella of protection, rings of corvettes, destroyers, and aircraft watching from above. The balance that had doomed Britain in 1940 had reversed itself entirely. The change was not sudden. It had been built ship by ship, rivet by rivet, until the mathematics of war finally broke in Britain's favor. In November 1942, the losses had reached their peak. 768,000 tons of merchant shipping sank in a single month. The numbers were horrifying. But behind those losses, the counterweight was growing. Hundreds of new corvettes joined the fight, closing the escort gap that had haunted the middle of the Atlantic. By the following spring, the same cold waters that had devoured convoys now held swarms of ships guarding them from every direction. The German wolf packs tried to adapt. They came in greater numbers, 20 or more at a time, and attacked in waves. But they no longer found the easy kills of earlier years. When a U-boat surfaced to shadow a convoy, radar picked it up. When it dove, sonar found it. When it tried to flee, a corvette or frigate was already waiting. The hunters were running out of room to move, out of time to strike, out of luck to survive. In May 1943, the change became undeniable. That month alone, 41 U-boats were destroyed. It was the worst single loss in the history of Germany's submarine arm. Admiral Dönitz ordered his fleet to withdraw from the North Atlantic entirely. The wolf packs, once the terror of the seas, were broken. The convoys sailed on. Behind that victory lay the same small ships that had once been mocked as little more than fishing boats in uniform. The Flower-class corvettes had done what no grand battleship or elegant destroyer could. They had filled the ocean with a shield so dense that the U-boats suffocated beneath it. There was no single heroic moment, no dramatic battle to mark the turning point. Just thousands of cold, wet hours endured by exhausted crews aboard slow, rolling ships that refused to go home. By mid-1943, the numbers told the story better than any speech. 187 corvettes patrolled the Atlantic alongside 94 destroyers. Every convoy now sailed with at least 8 escorts, often more. The once vulnerable shipping lanes had become fortresses of steel and noise, where sonar pings and depth charge blasts replaced the silence that U-boats had once used as cover. No convoy sailed unescorted anymore. The ocean that had been open and predatory was now fenced in by endurance. When the reports reached the Admiralty, there was no celebration. Only quiet relief. Britain would not starve. The factories would keep running. The soldiers in North Africa, Italy, and later France would receive their food, their fuel, their ammunition. The Atlantic lifeline had held. the war could continue. In ports from Liverpool to Halifax, corvettes limped home from patrols blackened by soot and crusted with salt. Their paint peeled, their hulls dented, their crews hollow-eyed with exhaustion. But their flag still flew. The sailors disembarked into air that smelled of coal smoke and coffee and knew that for once, they were coming home to a country that might actually win. The victory of May 1943 was not a triumph of technology or brilliance. It was the victory of endurance, of countless unnamed men working in shipyards, of crews who endured the endless gray sea without complaint. It was a victory of factories over fortresses, of quantity over perfection. And in that victory, the corvettes had earned their place among the great weapons of history, not by power, but by persistence. The tide had turned, and Britain still stood. Victory in the Atlantic did not come cheaply. It was bought with saltwater, sweat, and silence. For every U-boat sent to the bottom, another British crew paid in sleepless nights, frozen hands, and the constant fear of fire or steel in the dark. The ocean remained indifferent. It took lives without notice or reason, and the small ships bore the burden of its cruelty longer than any others. The Flower-class corvettes had always been fragile. Their hulls were built from merchant steel, thin and easily pierced. A single torpedo could tear them apart. When that happened, there was rarely time for distress signals or lifeboats. The explosion shattered everything in seconds, and the sea swallowed the wreckage whole. Each sinking left behind 80 names, sometimes more, written into the logbooks of the dead. Yet the replacements never stopped. As one ship disappeared beneath the gray surface, another left the slipways weeks later. Shipwrights worked through the night, knowing that the men who would crew their creation might already be alive only on paper. The system was brutal, mechanical, and necessary. The war did not slow for grief. Life aboard the surviving corvettes remained as harsh as ever. The rolling never eased, the cold never softened. The air inside the ships smelled of oil and damp canvas. The engines thundered endlessly, and sleep came only in short, uneasy fragments. The men were half-starved, half-frozen, and always wet. But when a merchant convoy reached port intact, when the final ship in the line came into view across the gray harbor, the misery found meaning. The numbers painted the truth more clearly than any story could. Between 1940 and 1945, 47 Flower-class corvettes were lost, 22 to U-boats, 11 to aircraft, 7 to mines, 4 to surface action, and 3 to collision. Each loss took an average of 65 men. Nearly 3,000 sailors never returned. Yet their sacrifice bought survival for millions. Because of them, food still reached the markets, coal still fed the factories, and soldiers at distant fronts still had the supplies to fight. Every convoy that arrived safely represented victory in its smallest, purest form. Not the grand kind of victory won by generals and parades, but the quiet kind earned by endurance. The corvettes were never fast enough to chase the enemy or strong enough to withstand a direct hit. But they were always present, and their presence was what the enemy feared most. For the men who served aboard them, the end of a patrol never meant peace. The moment they stepped ashore, another ship waited, another convoy, another endless stretch of gray water. They drank their beer in silence, laughed because it was easier than remembering, and climbed back aboard without complaint. The sea had taken friends from every deck, but it had not taken their will. When the official reports came after the war, the numbers almost seemed unbelievable. The Flower-class corvettes had taken part in the destruction of 294 U-boats. They had made the North Atlantic the deadliest hunting ground not for prey, but for the hunters. They had proven, beyond doubt, that simple persistence could defeat even the most advanced designs of war. The cost of endurance was measured not only in lives, but in years stolen by cold and exhaustion. Sailors left the service with scars that never healed and lungs that never recovered from the damp. Yet when asked, they spoke with pride. Not because they loved the ships, they did not, but because they knew what those ships had done. They had kept Britain alive. In the end, the Flower-class was not remembered for its beauty, or its speed, or its comfort. It was remembered for surviving what no one else could. They were born from desperation, built in haste, and sent into hell. And somehow they endured. When the war finally ended in 1945, the Atlantic grew silent again. The convoys still sailed, but no longer in fear. The ocean that had once been a graveyard for ships had become a highway of victory. The Flower-class corvettes, battered and scarred, limped home to harbors lined with cranes and gulls. Their paint was stripped by storms, their decks rusted by salt, but they carried the invisible weight of triumph. Many of the men who stepped ashore for the last time would never forget the rhythm of those engines or the way the ship rolled under their feet even in calm water. The motion haunted them long after the war ended. They had endured the unendurable, not for glory, but for necessity. Most had served without medals, without fame, and without fanfare. Their reward was survival, and the knowledge that because of them, their island nation had endured. The Admiralty's final accounting was a revelation in numbers and meaning. 267 Flower-class corvettes had been built, followed by 151 improved Castle-class successors. In total, 418 ships designed to guard convoys, hunt submarines, and hold the line. The entire program had cost $45 million, barely 3% of Britain's total naval expenditure. For that modest sum, the Royal Navy had purchased the time and space it needed to survive long enough for victory to become possible. Had Britain chosen to rely on destroyers alone, it would have bankrupted itself long before 1943. The shipyards would have been choked by complexity, the convoys left unprotected, and the country forced to seek peace before America could arrive in force. The corvettes, crude and uncelebrated, had bought not only the Atlantic but the war itself. Their simplicity had become a form of strategy. After the surrender of Germany, many of the corvettes found second lives. Some were sold into civilian service, stripped of their guns and painted fresh for work as cargo carriers, whether ships or training vessels. Others went to Allied nations, serving under new flags across distant seas. A few were scrapped, their metal melted down to rebuild the world they had helped save. But even in their afterlife, their legacy lingered. Naval architects who studied the Flower-class designs saw more than a relic. They saw a blueprint for a new kind of warfare, a proof that victory did not always belong to the strongest or fastest, but to the side that could build, repair, and endure without pause. Modern escort ships, frigates, and patrol vessels would all trace their lineage back to those small, stubborn hulls. In memorials across the ports of Britain and Canada, plaques bear the names of the ships and the men who sailed them: Bluebell, Gladiolus, Campanula, Marigold, and dozens more. Their names sound gentle, almost domestic, like something from gardens rather than battlefields. But beneath those names lie stories of endurance written in saltwater and steel. They were ships that rolled too hard, leaked too often, and fought too long. They were the reason Britain survived. The ocean forgets most things, but not them. Somewhere beneath the gray surface, pieces of their hulls still rest, covered in coral and silence. Above them, trade routes still cross the same waters, carrying food, fuel, and life across the Atlantic. Every passing ship, every safe arrival, is part of their legacy. The Flower-class corvettes were never beautiful. They were never fast. But they were enough. In a war where perfection drowned and simplicity survived, these small ships with the names of flowers proved that endurance can be the greatest weapon of all. They were built by ordinary people, sailed by ordinary men, and yet they changed the course of history. Their story remains a quiet reminder that sometimes survival itself is victory. And in that gray ocean between continents, the flowers still bloom.